She had been at the intersection for 16 years. The intersection was Maple and 7th in front of Eastwood Elementary School, which was a K-5 school with an enrollment of 314 students and a crossing that had been designated by the city's traffic safety office as requiring a crossing guard because of the volume of traffic on Maple Avenue in the mornings and afternoons, and the specific blind turn problem where 7th Street curved to meet Maple at an angle that made the crossing difficult for drivers to anticipate, even when they were paying attention, which they often were not. Her name was Dolores Jean Morgan. She was 67 years old. She had been a crossing guard at Maple and 7th for 16 years, which was longer than any active crossing guard in the school district's program. She had been hired the September after her husband Arthur retired. He had been a mail carrier for the post office for 31 years, and they had retired within a year of each other, and she had taken the crossing guard position because she had needed something to do in the mornings, and because she had always been a person who was most useful, most fully herself when she was doing something that required her to be present and attentive and directly responsible for other people's safety. The crossing guard position was all three. She had applied in early August and had been hired in the first week of September and had started on the first day of the school year, which was the Tuesday after Labor Day. The interviewer had asked her what she understood the job to be. She had said the job is keeping children safe at a dangerous intersection. The interviewer had said, and what does that require? She had said, attention. She had said it requires full attention every morning and every afternoon that school is in session. She had said, I am good at paying attention. The interviewer had said, how do you know? She had said, because I have been paying attention to people for 50 years, and I have not stopped yet. She had been hired. She was 5'2", and in 16 years had never been mistaken for someone who was not in charge of the crossing. She wore the orange vest and the hat with the reflective band, and she carried the stop sign paddle that she raised when she stepped off the curb, and she raised it with the specific authority of someone who understood that the authority was not in her size, but in the 16 years of people who had learned that when Dolores Morgan raised that sign, cars stopped. They stopped because she had been consistent, and because consistency over 16 years produces the specific kind of expectation that is more reliable than any individual act of authority. She had replaced the hat twice and the vest 3 times in 16 years. The original vest had been a size too large. The district's equipment allocation had not been designed with her measurements in mind, and she had worn it for the first year with the excess material tucked in before the district approved a replacement in the correct size. The hat she had on currently was the second replacement purchased when the previous hat had been lost on the morning a windstorm came through in October of the 12th year, the kind of wind that takes hats and does not return them. She had finished the morning crossing without the hat because the children needed to cross regardless of the hat. The district had issued a replacement the next day. She had put it on and adjusted it in the car's visor mirror the same way she adjusted it every morning. She had purchased her own flashlight for the winter mornings when she arrived before sunrise. The district's equipment did not include a flashlight. She had bought one the second winter when she realized that being visible to early drivers in the dark was the same kind of important as the vest, and that waiting for the district to provide it would mean waiting in the dark in the interim. She had bought a good one. She had been using it for 14 years. The batteries went in her bag with the extra change of gloves she kept for the very cold mornings, and the small package of individually wrapped hard candies she gave to children who had clearly not eaten breakfast. She did not tell them. This was the reason she said she had too many, and would they like one, and they always said yes, and it was always the ones who had not eaten who said yes most quickly. She knew the children by name. Not all 314, but the ones who crossed at Maple and 7th every morning and afternoon, the ones who came alone or in small groups from the neighborhoods east of the school, and who crossed her intersection as part of their daily route. She knew them from kindergarten through 5th grade. She had watched children arrive at her crossing on their first day of school, small and uncertain, and had learned their names in the first week, and had watched them leave for middle school 5 years later, taller and more confident, some of them stopping to tell her where they were going, some of them simply waving, all of them known. She had watched children grow in the specific way you watch children grow when you see them every day for 5 years. Not dramatically, but incrementally, the way a plant grows so that the change is visible only when you look at the distance between the beginning and where they are now. She had learned the children's names the same way her husband Arthur had learned the names on his postal route, by paying attention on the first day and the second day and the third, and by understanding that the name was not a piece of information you filed and retrieved, but a piece of relationship that you built. Arthur had said this to her once early in his career: the name is the beginning of the relationship. Everything else you learn about a person comes after you know their name. She had thought about this for 30 years, and had decided he was right, and she had applied it at her crossing from the first week. She knew the children's names. She knew the names of their dogs and their younger siblings and their teachers. She knew which ones had a hard day on Mondays, and which ones were brightest on Fridays, and which ones, the ones who were at the crossing alone without a parent, needed to know that someone at the crossing knew who they were and was glad to see them. She had been watching children cross at this intersection for 16 years, which was over 3,000 mornings and 3,000 afternoons. In that time, she had seen the neighborhood change around her. The houses on 7th Street that had been rentals and were now owned the families who had arrived, and the families who had moved on the school enrollment that had shifted and then stabilized the new apartment building on Maple that had brought 60 additional children to the district's numbers in a single year, many of whom crossed at her intersection. She had watched the school's teaching staff change and had become in the process a figure that was continuous in a way that teachers and administrators could not be the person who was there every morning and afternoon. Regardless of what changed inside the building, who knew the children across multiple years, and teachers who was the constant at the outside of the school that the inside of the school could not provide. She had learned over 16 years that the children who needed something were usually able to communicate it in the 20 seconds between the curb and the far side of the crosswalk, if you paid attention to how they were walking and what they were carrying and whether they were making eye contact. Most children who were fine made eye contact. Children who were not fine often looked at their shoes. She had learned to say something during the crossing in those cases, something small and specific, the kind of thing that said, "I see you. I know who you are. I have been watching you for long enough to know that today is different from yesterday." She did not always have the right thing to say. Most of the time she did. 16 years of watching children had produced in her a specific competence for this that she had not known she was developing until it was already there. The competence was not transferable in the way that technical skills are transferable. She could not teach another crossing guard how to see what she saw in a child's walk across a crosswalk. She could tell them to look to pay attention to the specific quality of how a child moved, whether the movement was lighter or heavier than the same child's movement the day before, whether they were holding their bag differently or looking at a different part of the sidewalk. But the interpretation of what they saw would take the years to develop. It took 16 years to get to where she was. That was the only way it worked. You paid attention every day for a long time, and the long time built the capacity, and the capacity was what allowed you to see the thing in 3 seconds. This was the thing she had not said to Anthony Reeves when he told her the record spoke for itself. The record was 16 years of no complaints, which was the administrative fact of the 16 years. The 16 years itself was something different, something that was visible in the way she moved on the crossing and in the way the children responded to her and in the way the parents trusted the intersection. The record described the absence of failure. The 16 years described the presence of something that was not failure, which was a different and larger thing. But the record was the language the institution used, and she was glad the record said what it said, because the record was what had been read and what had been believed. Arthur had said once that the postal route was the same thing. He had said 31 years of the same route, and people think the route is what matters. She had said what matters. He had said knowing the route so well that you know when something is different. She had said yes. He had said that's not the route. That is the 31 years. She had said yes. He had said, and 31 years doesn't go anywhere. He had said it stays in you. She had thought about this and had said yes. She had said that's right. She had carried 16 years at Maple and 7th in the specific way Arthur had carried 31 years on his postal route, not as an accumulation of sameness, but as an accumulation of attention, which was a different thing, because attention that is paid every day for a long time produces something in the person paying it that is different from simple repetition. She had paid attention every morning and afternoon for 16 years, and the attention had produced in her the capacity to know, in the 3 seconds between a child reaching the curb and the crossing beginning what that child needed from the morning. She did not know how she knew. She knew that she knew. She had known it for a long time. She knew which children needed encouragement in the morning and which ones were the kind of morning children who were already talking when they arrived at the curb. And she knew which ones were quiet in the afternoon because something had happened at school that day, and which ones were quiet because they were just quiet. She knew the parents and grandparents who walked the children to the crossing, the grandmother who walked her twin granddaughters every morning, and who had told Dolores in the first week that she had also had a crossing guard at this intersection 30 years ago when she was a child herself, and that she was glad the corner still had someone on it. She knew the parents who drove past and gave her a wave through the windshield, and she knew the new parents in the first weeks of kindergarten who hovered at the curb until they were sure their child had made it across. There was a child named Marcus Ellery who had started at Eastwood Elementary 4 years ago in kindergarten and who had been crossing at Maple and 7th since his first day. He had arrived the first day with his mother and had been terrified of the crossing, not because he was a frightened child, but because Maple Avenue had a particular quality at 7:55 in the morning with full school day traffic that was legitimately intimidating to a 5-year-old who had never crossed a 4-lane road. His mother had walked with him to the curb, and Dolores had raised the paddle and said, "Marcus." He had looked at her. She had said, "Do you know why I'm here?" He had shaken his head. She had said, "I am here so that cars stop for you." She had said, "Every morning when you come to this corner, I am going to stop the cars. All you have to do is walk across." He had looked at the stopped cars. He had looked at Dolores. He had held his mother's hand and crossed. The next morning he had arrived alone because his mother worked early and the elementary school had a before-care program. And he had stood at the curb and looked at Dolores, and she had raised the paddle and stopped the cars, and he had crossed. He had been crossing alone every morning since then. He was 9 now, and he crossed with the specific confidence of a child who has been doing something safely for 4 years, and who knows exactly what to do when he gets to the curb. There was a girl named Simone Waters who had been Dolores's crossing for 3 years, and who was now in her final year before middle school. Simone was a talker. She had something to say every morning and every afternoon, and what she said was always about something specific that had happened that day, or was going to happen that day, and she said it in the 8 seconds between the curb and the far side of the crosswalk in the compressed, efficient way of a child who has learned that the crossing is the window for the information, and who has adjusted her communication style to fit the window. Dolores had learned to track 3 conversations with Simone simultaneously, the one from the morning, the one from the afternoon, and the developing thread between them that Simone was weaving over the course of the school day. She was going to miss Simone when she left for middle school in June. She had thought about this already. She had a particular quality of presence at the crossing, the quality that the children responded to and that the parents trusted, and that the drivers had learned to expect. It was not the quality of someone performing a role. It was the quality of someone who was entirely and genuinely there for the purpose of keeping children safe at a difficult intersection, and who had been entirely and genuinely there for 16 years, and who would continue to be there because that was what she was there for. Arthur Morgan had retired from the post office in July of the year Dolores started at the crossing. He had been a mail carrier for 31 years on the same 2-mile route, which was a route he had taken over at 31 and driven and walked every working day until he was 62. He was now 71 and spent his mornings in the garden and his afternoons at the library, and he drove Dolores to her crossing every morning because she did not drive, and because walking the 6 blocks at 6:50 in October required a level of cold weather commitment that he was not prepared to ask of her. He waited in the car for the first 20 minutes, and then drove home and came back at 8:15 to take her home for breakfast. He had been doing this for 16 years. He had attended every district crossing guard recognition event. He had attended the first one, which was a modest event in the district's conference room with coffee and 2 chairs for the guards who were being recognized, and the most recent one, which was held in the school's gymnasium with a reception after. He had watched Dolores receive the certificate for 25 years of service. The district counted from when she had applied, not from when she had started, and he had said when she showed him the certificate that evening 25 years. She had said they counted from the application. He had said the application counted. He had said 25 years at that corner. She had said yes. He had looked at her. He had said, Arthur Morgan's wife. She had laughed. She said yes. He had said, and don't forget it. Don't. He was the first person she told about the complaint. She had come home from the afternoon crossing on the Tuesday. The complaint was filed and had told him over dinner. He had listened. He had been quiet for a moment. He had said a driver who had to wait. She had said yes. He had said at an active school crossing. She had said yes. He had been quiet again. He had said, what did Anthony say? She said, he's going to review it. Arthur said he'll find what he finds. She said yes. Arthur said, do you know what he'll find? She said yes. He said good. He said, eat your dinner. She had eaten her dinner. The man who filed the complaint was named Dennis Hartwell. He was 37. He had moved to the neighborhood 11 months before the incident and had not previously had occasion to interact with Dolores Morgan or to drive through the Maple and 7th intersection during the school commute hours. He worked in sales and drove through the intersection at 7:45 on some mornings when his route to the highway took him past the school, and on 3 of those mornings, in the months before the complaint, he had been stopped at the crossing while Dolores guided children across, which was what the crossing guard at that intersection was there to do. He had a history of 2 prior complaints with the district. Not about Dolores specifically, but about traffic management near school zones generally. He had written to the district's transportation office 8 months earlier, saying that the traffic signal timing at Maple and 9th was creating a bottleneck during the morning commute. He had written again 2 months after that, saying that the crossing at the elementary school on Cedar was improperly managed and was holding traffic for excessive periods. Neither complaint had produced the result he sought, which was a reduction in the time drivers were required to wait near the school zone. He did not understand this the way someone who had lived in the neighborhood for 11 months and driven past an active school crossing 3 times had the opportunity to understand it. He had been stopped at the crossing 3 times before the first complaint. The first time he had waited for 45 seconds while a group of 6 children crossed, which was 45 seconds longer than he had anticipated and which had caused him to miss a traffic window on Maple Avenue that would have added approximately 3 minutes to his drive. He had said nothing that first time. The second time, the crossing had taken 60 seconds because the same group of 6 children had been joined by 3 others, and because one of the 9 children had dropped a water bottle in the crosswalk and had stopped to pick it up while Dolores kept the paddle raised. He had noticed the delay. The third time, the crossing had taken 70 seconds because 12 children had crossed together, and when the last child, the girl in the yellow raincoat, had stopped to look at a puddle, he had rolled his window down. He did not understand that the 70 seconds was the crossing's duration because 12 children needed 70 seconds to cross a 4-lane road safely, and that the crossing guard raising the paddle until the last child reached the far side was not a choice but a requirement, and that a crossing guard who lowered the paddle before the last child reached the far side would have been failing to do her job. He understood the 70 seconds as a failure of management on the crossing guard's part. He was wrong. He filed a complaint because he believed he was correct. He filed a complaint with the school district's Community Relations Office on a Tuesday in October. The complaint said that the crossing guard at Maple and 7th was hostile to drivers, that she was excessive in the duration of the crossings, that she had made a gesture at him that he described as aggressive, and that she was creating a safety hazard by holding traffic beyond the point when children were still crossing. The Community Relations Office logged the complaint and forwarded it to the crossing guard program supervisor, a man named Anthony Reeves, who had been the supervisor for 9 years. He had managed 34 crossing guards across the district's program, and had been in those 9 years the person responsible for the hiring, supervision, incident review, and support of every crossing guard who worked at the district's designated crossings. He had evaluated hundreds of complaints, formal and informal, across 9 years. He knew what a substantive complaint looked like and what a non-substantive complaint looked like. He knew Dolores Morgan. He knew her record. He had attended her 15-year recognition ceremony the previous year and had said to her at the reception, after that she was the model for what the program was supposed to produce. She had said, "I am just doing the crossing." He had said no. He had said, "That is what you say, but that is not what you do." And the difference between those two things is what 15 years looks like. She had looked at him. She had said, "I am just doing the crossing." He had laughed. He had made a note to review the complaint at the next program review and to flag it for follow-up. 3 weeks later, Dennis Hartwell filed a second complaint. The second complaint repeated the claims of the first and added that the crossing guard had been rude to him specifically when he rolled his window down to express his concern. He described the exchange. He said Dolores had told him she was there to keep the children safe and that he needed to wait until the crossing was complete, and that she had said this in a tone that he found disrespectful. The Community Relations Office received the second complaint and forwarded it to Anthony Reeves. He reviewed both complaints together. He had known Dolores for 9 years. He had also received 2 prior complaints about her in those 9 years, both from drivers, both making similar claims about the duration of the crossings. Both prior complaints had been reviewed individually and found to be without substantive basis. The crossing procedure at Maple and 7th was within the program's guidelines, and the duration of the crossings was appropriate to the volume and pace of children crossing. He reviewed all 4 complaints together now. The pattern was consistent. In each of the 4 complaints, the claim was that Dolores was holding traffic longer than necessary. In each case, the crossing duration had been within guidelines. In each case, the complainant was a driver who had been stopped at the intersection during the school hours when children were actively crossing. Anthony Reeves wrote in his supervisor's assessment, "The 4 complaints read in sequence do not describe a crossing guard who is performing incorrectly. They describe drivers who are frustrated by the requirement to stop at an active school crossing. No action is warranted against the crossing guard. I am recommending that the Community Relations Office send a response to the most recent complainant explaining the legal requirements at a designated school crossing." He also pulled the camera footage. The crossing program had installed exterior cameras at the 3 busiest school crossings in the district 2 years ago as part of a traffic safety initiative. The camera at Maple and 7th was a fixed-angle camera mounted on the utility pole at the northwest corner of the intersection, covering the full crossing area and part of the adjacent roadway. It had been running continuously since installation. Anthony Reeves pulled the footage from the dates that matched the 2 most recent complaints. He watched the footage. He made notes. He watched for the full duration of both morning sessions on the dates in question. Not just the moments that matched the complaints, but the full mornings, because the context of a crossing guard's work is the full morning, and not just the moments where a specific interaction occurred. He watched Dolores Morgan work the crossing the way she had been working it for 16 years. He watched her arrive at the corner at 7:28, which was 2 minutes before her posted start time, and set up her position with the specific methodical efficiency of someone who has done this same setup thousands of times, and who knows the exact positioning that gives her the best sightline down both the incoming traffic lanes while maintaining the closest proximity to the crosswalk. He watched her raise the paddle and step off the curb with the timing of someone who has assessed the pattern of traffic at this specific intersection for 16 years. The specific moment when the light at Maple and 8th turned green and traffic began moving, and the specific number of seconds before that traffic reached her crossing, and the window between that traffic and the next light cycle during which it was safe to stop vehicles and move children. She did not count seconds consciously. She did not need to. The timing was in her body. He watched her guide the children across the groups of 3 and 4 and 5. The occasional lone child who came in the seconds just before the bell rang, the child on a bike who always needed a reminder to walk the bike across the crosswalk, who had been needing that reminder since September, and who received it each morning with the patient consistency of a correction that is given for the child's safety and not for the correction's sake. He watched the way she communicated with drivers, the nod when the crossing was complete, the held paddle when it was not the brief direct eye contact with drivers who seemed uncertain about whether to proceed, which resolved the uncertainty in a second. He watched the morning the way it was, which was a school crossing that worked, because the person responsible for it was entirely competent at the job, and had been entirely competent at it for 16 years. He watched the specific exchange that Dennis Hartwell had described as hostile. What the camera showed was this Dennis Hartwell's vehicle was the 3rd car in the left lane at the crossing stopped while children crossed. The crossing had been open for approximately 45 seconds at that point. The children still in the crosswalk were 3, including the girl in the yellow raincoat who was moving at the pace of someone who finds puddles worth investigating. Hartwell had rolled his window down. His body language showed him leaning toward the open window in the direction of the crossing. He said something. The camera's audio was present but not clear at that distance. Anthony Reeves could hear that something was said, but could not make out the words. The body language was readable. He was not asking a question. He was expressing a complaint. Dolores had heard him. She had looked at him. She had not left the curb. She remained in her position, which was the correct position, which was at the edge of the curb at the point of the crosswalk. She had said something in response. The children were still in the crosswalk. The girl in the yellow raincoat had just discovered the largest puddle in the crosswalk and had paused to assess it. Dolores had watched the girl assess the puddle and had not hurried her because hurrying a child across a crosswalk to accommodate an impatient driver is not the purpose of the crossing guard position and is a different kind of unsafe than the one the crossing guard is employed to prevent. When the last child, the girl in the yellow raincoat who had decided to walk around the puddle rather than through it, which was its own small lesson in judgment, reached the far curb, Dolores lowered the paddle and gave the waiting cars the specific nod she always gave when the crossing was complete. Dennis Hartwell's car drove through. His window was still down. His car did not stop or slow further. At no point in the footage was Dolores's behavior outside the program's guidelines. She had not left her position during an active crossing to approach a driver's vehicle. She had not shouted or gestured aggressively. She had said something from the curb to a driver who had spoken to her during an active crossing, which was a distraction from her primary function, that she had managed without allowing it to compromise that function. At every point, she was doing exactly what a crossing guard is supposed to do at an active school crossing, including the part where she kept her attention on the children while a driver attempted to engage her in a conversation about the length of the crossing. Anthony Reeves sent his supervisor's assessment to the Community Relations Director, Patricia Vance, who had been in her role for 6 years and who had processed dozens of complaints about district staff over those 6 years. She had developed a specific view about the relationship between complaints and records, which was a complaint tells you that someone is unhappy. The record tells you whether the unhappiness has a legitimate basis. The function of the Community Relations Office was to listen to the first and assess it against the second, which required that the second be available and readable. She read Anthony's assessment. She read it thoroughly. She watched the clip. She watched it twice. She read the 4 prior complaints in sequence as Anthony had read them. She saw what he had seen. She wrote her response to Dennis Hartwell carefully, because a response to a formal complaint that disagrees with the complainant requires a specific kind of care. Not the care of softening the disagreement, but the care of making it precise enough that the complainant understands what he is being told and why. She wrote, "We have reviewed the complaint you submitted on October 14th and the follow-up complaint submitted on November 2nd. We have also reviewed the camera footage from the Maple and 7th crossing on both relevant dates, and the crossing program supervisor's assessment of the crossing guard's conduct. We have found that the crossing guard's conduct on both occasions was within all program guidelines and was appropriate to an active school crossing. The duration of the crossing is determined by the number and pace of children crossing at the time, which is the legally mandated priority at a designated school crossing. The footage does not support the characterization of the guard's conduct as hostile. We are closing these complaints with no action against the crossing guard. We have enclosed a copy of the city's school zone traffic law, which sets out the legal requirements for drivers at designated school crossings." She sent the letter. She closed the complaint file. She called Anthony Reeves and said the footage is the record. He said it is. She said, "I want to make sure we archive it correctly." He said, "I have it." She said, "Good." Anthony Reeves sent his supervisor's full assessment to the Community Relations Director with the clip attached as the formal documentation of the review. The assessment was 5 paragraphs. The 5th paragraph said Dolores Morgan has been at Maple and 7th for 16 years. In those 16 years, there have been 4 complaints about her work, all from drivers, all claiming that crossings were of excessive duration. All 4 have been reviewed, and all 4 have been found without substantive basis. The crossing duration at Maple and 7th is consistently within program guidelines. The guard's conduct is consistently professional. This record should be read alongside any future complaints as evidence of the character of the complaints rather than the character of the guard. Patricia Vance read the 5th paragraph twice. She added it to the policy guidance file for the Community Relations Office in the section on evaluating pattern complaints against program staff. She labeled it sample language for records-based assessment. What happened next was not something Anthony Reeves had planned or expected. The school board meeting in November had a public comment period, as all school board meetings did, and in the public comment period there were 12 speakers. The 11th speaker was a parent named Nadia Okonkwo, who was the mother of a 2nd grader who crossed at Maple and 7th every morning. She said, "I want to speak about the crossing guard at Maple and 7th. She said, I heard there was a complaint filed. She said, I want to tell the board what 16 years at that intersection looks like from the other side of it." She spoke for 3 minutes. She did not go over her 3 minutes because she had prepared carefully and because she had learned from watching other parents speak at school board meetings that going over time reduces impact rather than increasing it. She said that Dolores Morgan had known her daughter's name before the 2nd day of school. She said that she had driven past the crossing on the first day to see the route and had heard Dolores say Nadia's name to her daughter as she walked up to the curb, and that Nadia had looked up, surprised and pleased, and had crossed the street in the particular way of a child who has just been recognized by someone she was not expecting to be recognized by the specific, upright, confident walk of someone who has been seen. She said that on a morning in March, she gave the month precisely because she wanted the board to understand that this was a specific thing, not a vague impression her daughter had arrived at the crossing in the way that children arrive when something is wrong at home and they are bringing it to school with them, which is quietly with their eyes slightly down and with a quality of weight that is different from their usual quality. She said Dolores noticed within 3 seconds of seeing her. She said in the 20 seconds it took to cross the street, Dolores said one sentence to my daughter. She did not say what the sentence was because the sentence was personal and between Dolores and Nadia, and it was not hers to repeat. She said my daughter remembered that sentence for months. She said she still talks about it. She said I have been trying since March to understand how a crossing guard knows in 3 seconds what a child needs to hear. She said, I have concluded that the answer is 16 years of paying attention. She said the board should know what it has at that intersection before it considers any complaint from a driver who was required to wait 90 seconds for children to cross the street safely in accordance with the law. The 12th speaker was a man named Howard Liu, who was a parent of 2 children who had both crossed at Maple and 7th, the first for 5 years and the second for 3 years and counting. He said, I want to add to what the previous speaker said. He said, I have driven past that intersection at 7:45 in the morning when I am behind a driver who is frustrated. I have seen what Dolores Morgan does in that situation. She keeps doing her job. He said the job is keeping children safe at a difficult intersection. He said she has been doing it for 16 years without a substantive complaint. He said, I know what a difficult intersection looks like. He said, I also know what someone who is very good at a very difficult job looks like. He said the board is looking at one right now. The board president, a woman named Catherine Ellison, said at the end of the public comment period, I want to note for the record that the complaints referenced in the public comment have been reviewed by the Crossing Guard Program Supervisor and have been found to be without substantive basis. She said the crossing guard at Maple and 7th has a record that is exemplary in every respect. She said that record speaks for itself and does not require the board's intervention. She said the board thanks the speakers for their comments and thanks Ms. Morgan for 16 years of service at that intersection. 9 people had spoken before Nadia Okonkwo. The public comment period at school board meetings was usually composed of parents speaking about curriculum decisions, budget concerns, and facility requests, and the 9 speakers. Before Celia had spoken about those things, a parent requesting additional reading support resources, 2 parents speaking in support of a proposed before-school program, a community member concerned about the athletic field drainage issue that had been in front of the board for 3 meetings, and others. The board had listened and made notes and thanked each speaker. Nadia Okonkwo had prepared what she was going to say, though not as a written script. She had written 3 things on a note card which were the 3 things she most needed to say, and she had said them in the order she wrote them, and she had said them clearly, and she had not gone over her 3 minutes because she had timed herself at home and knew when to stop. Howard Liu had not prepared. He had come to the meeting because his wife had texted him from the school pickup line that someone was speaking at the board meeting about the crossing guard, and he had turned his car toward the school instead of toward home, because he had a view about the crossing guard at Maple and 7th that he had not yet expressed to anyone official, and that seemed relevant now. He had not been planning to speak until Celia finished, at which point he had understood that there was something he needed to add, and that the public comment period was still open and that he should add it. The board president, Catherine Ellison, had been on the school board for 7 years. She had run on a platform of operational accountability, and had served on the board long enough to know the difference between a public comment that was expressing personal preference and a public comment that was describing something the board needed to understand about how the district worked and for whom. She had listened to Celia Okonkwo and Howard Liu with the specific attention she gave to comments that were about the latter. She had known before they finished speaking what she was going to say at the end of the comment period. She said, "I want to note for the record that the complaints referenced in the public comment have been reviewed by the crossing guard program supervisor and have been found to be without substantive basis." She said the crossing guard at Maple and 7th has a record that is exemplary in every respect. She said that record speaks for itself and does not require the board's intervention. She said the board thanks the speakers for their comments and thanks Ms. Morgan for 16 years of service at that intersection. The public comment had not been in the agenda. The board had not expected it. Catherine Ellison had not known it was coming. She said what she said because the record was what it was and because what she said was accurate. Howard Liu said, "I have been a driver on Maple Avenue at 7:45 in the morning. I have been behind drivers who are frustrated by the crossing. I want the board to understand what I have observed from that position. I have watched a frustrated driver speak to Dolores Morgan from his vehicle during an active crossing. I have watched Dolores Morgan respond from the curb without leaving her position and without taking her attention off the children in the crosswalk for more than the 1 second required to address the driver. I have watched the last child complete the crossing. I have watched Dolores lower the paddle and nod to the waiting cars. I have watched the frustrated driver's car drive through. I have watched this sequence and I have thought, that is someone who is very good at a very difficult job." He said, "I know what a difficult intersection looks like. The Maple and 7th intersection has a blind turn from 7th that makes it genuinely hazardous during school hours. I know what someone who is managing that intersection correctly looks like." He said the board has one. He said, "I wanted you to know what I observed from the other side of the crossing." Dolores Morgan was not at the school board meeting. She was at home where she was every evening by 5:30 because the afternoon crossing ended at 3:45, and she was usually home by 4, and she had been making dinner at 4:30 for 50 years. And she was not going to stop making dinner at 4:30 because there was a school board meeting that might or might not say something about her. She had known about the meeting because Anthony Reeves had told her that the complaint had been submitted and had been reviewed and had been found without basis, and she had said, "All right." He had said, "I wanted to tell you personally." She had said, "I appreciate that." She had said, "You looked at the footage." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "And." He had said, "You were doing your job." She had said, "I know." He had said, "I know you know." He had said, "I wanted you to hear it from me." She had said, "Thank you, Anthony." She had said, "Is there anything else?" He had said, "No." She had said, "Then I will see you at the program review." She had hung up the phone and gone back to dinner. Arthur had asked at dinner whether anything was going to come of the complaint. She had said, "No." He had said, "Anthony looked at the footage." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "And he found what he found." She had said, "Yes." Arthur had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "You were just doing the crossing." She had looked at him. She had said, "That is what I said." He had smiled. He had said, "Yes." He had said, "That is what you always say." She had said, "Because it is always what I am doing." He had said, "I know." He had said, "And it is always right." Celia Okonkwo called her the next morning before the crossing. She said, "I spoke at the school board meeting last night. Dolores said I heard. Celia said, I wanted you to know what I said. Dolores said, I know what you said. Celia said, Nadia told you. Dolores said, yes. Celia said, was it all right that I said it? Dolores was quiet for a moment. She said, you did not need to do that. Celia said, no. She said, but I wanted to. Dolores said, I know. She said, thank you, Celia. She said, I have to go. The crossing starts in 8 minutes. Celia said, I know. She said, "Go keep my daughter safe." Dolores said she is always safe at that corner. She said, "I will see her this morning." She hung up the phone and put on her orange vest. Arthur drove her to the crossing the next morning, as he always did. The morning was cold in the specific flat way of November. She put on the orange vest in the car because the car was warm and the corner would not be. Arthur said, "Are you ready?" She said, "I am always ready." He said, "I know." He pulled up to the corner. She got out. The first child arrived at 7:32. His name was Corey, and he was in second grade, and he arrived early every morning because his grandmother dropped him before her own shift started, and the Before Care program opened at 7:30. And Corey used the minutes between 7:30 and the first bell to stand at the curb and talk. He had been doing this since September. In the months since September, she had learned that he had a younger sister named Petra, that his grandmother made rice every Sunday, and that he wanted to be a veterinarian because he believed that animals needed more people who would listen to them carefully. He said, "Good morning, Miss Dolores." She said, "Good morning, Corey." He said, "My grandmother says it might snow this weekend." She said it might. He said, "She is worried about the driveway." She said, "Tell her to put salt down on Saturday morning before it starts." He said, "Does that help?" She said, "It helps." He considered this. He said, "Okay, I'll tell her." He stood with her for 4 more minutes, talking about sharks. He was reading a book about sharks and had recently learned that some of them were very small, which he had not expected, and at 7:37 he went inside. She heard about the school board meeting from Nadia Okonkwo's daughter. Not from Celia directly, but from the daughter whose name was Nadia, who arrived at the crossing the next morning at 7:51, which was a minute and a half before the bell, which was when Nadia always arrived, and who said, "My mom was at the school board meeting last night." Dolores said yes. Nadia said she said something about you. Dolores said, "I heard." Nadia said, "Was it okay what she said?" Dolores said it was very kind. Nadia said she said you knew exactly the right thing to say that one morning. Dolores said, "I remember that morning." Nadia said, "How did you know what to say?" Dolores thought for a moment. She said, "I have been watching children for 16 years. She said, when you watch someone carefully enough, you know what they need." She looked at Nadia. She said, "Are you ready to cross?" Nadia said yes. Dolores raised the paddle and stepped off the curb. The children crossed. The cars waited. The bell rang. The morning proceeded. Catherine Ellison, the board president, had said what she said at the board meeting and had meant it. She had also, on the Wednesday after the meeting, called Anthony Reeves to ask about the camera footage program. She had not been aware before Howard Liu mentioned the difficulty of the intersection from a driver's perspective that the camera footage had been what confirmed the supervisor's assessment. She asked Anthony to walk her through what the footage showed. He did. She listened. She said the footage is what resolved the complaint. He said the footage confirmed what the record already showed, which was that Dolores has been doing the job correctly for 16 years. She said the record. He said 16 years with no substantive complaint. She said that is also evidence. He said yes. He said in a case like this where the complaint is about whether the person is doing the job correctly, the record of having done the job correctly for 16 years is the most relevant evidence you have. She said, "I want to put something in the program budget for next year." She said, "I want to expand the camera program to the other 5 designated crossings." He said yes. She said, "Because the footage is the record when the record is needed." He said yes. She said, "All right." She said, "Send me a proposal." She received the proposal. It was approved in January. The camera program was expanded to all 8 designated crossings in the district by the following September. Marcus Ellery, who was 9 years old and who had been crossing at Maple and 7th since his first day of kindergarten, was not aware of the school board meeting or the complaints or the camera footage. He was aware of Dolores Morgan in the way children are aware of the people who are consistently and reliably present in their lives, not analytically, but as a fact of the morning, a constant that he did not question because it had never not been there. He had grown from the small and uncertain child who had stood at the curb on the first day of kindergarten and heard Dolores tell him that she was there to stop the cars into a fourth grader who crossed with his hands in his jacket pockets and a backpack that was heavier than it needed to be, and who said good morning to Dolores in the distracted, slightly absent way of a 9-year-old who has already moved most of his attention to whatever was going to happen that day at school. She said good morning to him in the specific warm, present way she said good morning to all of them. He crossed. He went in. He did not think about the crossing until he was on the far side of it, which was the way it was supposed to work. The children crossed. The cars waited. The bell rang. The morning proceeded in the way it had proceeded for 16 years because the person who was there was the person who had been there paying attention, knowing the names, watching the children, keeping them safe, and doing it the same way every day for 16 years without variation and without substantive complaint, because that was what the intersection required, and because she was entirely and genuinely there for the purpose of providing it. Dennis Hartwell received the Community Relations Office's response to his complaints. He read the letter. He did not respond to it. He continued to drive through the Maple and 7th intersection on some mornings on his way to the highway, and he stopped at the crossing when the crossing guard raised the paddle, and he waited until the crossing was complete, and he drove through when the nod came. The record of his complaints was in the Community Relations Office's file alongside Anthony's supervisor's assessment and the clip from the footage, and it would remain there because documentation of complaints is kept even when the complaints are found without basis, because the documentation of both the complaint and its resolution is the full record of what happened and what was determined. Anthony Reeves had the camera footage archived in the program's records. He had the supervisor's assessment in the complaint file. He had the 4 complaints read together and his finding that they did not describe a crossing guard performing incorrectly, but drivers frustrated by the requirement to stop at an active school crossing. He had 16 years of no substantive complaints and a record that Catherine Ellison had called exemplary in the school board record, and that was. He had also been the person who in 9 years as program supervisor had evaluated the most complaints about crossing guards in the district's program, and who had the most complete understanding of what the difference was between a complaint that described a real problem and a complaint that described a driver's frustration with a legal requirement. He had read the 4 complaints against Dolores Morgan and had known within 2 minutes of reading the first one what the pattern was. He had confirmed it with the footage. He had written the assessment. He had submitted it. He had closed the file. He had also kept a copy of the footage clip in his personal archive, because it was the best documentation he had ever seen of what a crossing guard in full control of her crossing looked like, and because he intended to use it in the next program training as an example of what the job was and how it was done correctly. He also had the clip from the footage of the specific morning the yellow raincoat girl moving through the puddles at the pace of a child who has recently discovered that puddles are worth investigating. Dolores at the curb in her full proper position, the paddle raised for the last child's complete transit without any reduction in the signal that children were crossing the nod when the crossing was complete, the line of cars moving through. He had watched it several times. Each time he watched it, he saw the same things: a child being kept safe by someone who had been keeping children safe at this specific intersection for 16 years, and a driver who had decided that the person keeping children safe was the problem. And the moment when the crossing was complete, and the driver's complaint was revealed to have been about 90 seconds, and a small girl in a yellow raincoat deciding that a puddle was worth a second look. He sent the clip to Patricia Vance with a note that said, "This is what the program looks like when it is working. Please keep it." She kept it. She put it in the Community Relations Office's training file alongside the policy guidance Anthony had written. She labeled it Maple and 7th November, Standard. The clip was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, and it showed the full crossing on the morning of the second complaint from the moment Dolores raised the paddle to the moment she nodded to the waiting cars that the crossing was complete. It showed 12 children crossing. It showed the girl in the yellow raincoat pausing at the puddle. It showed Dolores holding the paddle until the girl reached the far side. It showed the exchange with the driver. It showed Dolores's position throughout at the curb in her proper position, not at the driver's window, not gesturing aggressively, not raising her voice, not doing anything other than her job. It showed what the job looked like when it was done correctly. Patricia Vance used it in the next community relations staff training as an example of what footage-based review produced in cases where the complaint description and the recorded reality did not match. She said, "This is what we are looking for when we pull the footage. We are looking for the difference between what is described and what is documented. In this case, what is described is a hostile crossing guard. What is documented is a crossing guard doing her job correctly for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She said the difference between those two things is the record. The record is always what matters." Anthony Reeves, who had been invited to speak at the training, said the record in this case also included 16 years of no substantive complaints. He said that record is not separate from the footage. It is the context that makes the footage interpretable. He said a crossing guard at a difficult intersection with 16 years of no complaints and footage showing correct conduct is not the same as a crossing guard with a different record and the same footage. The footage means what the full record says it means. He said, "Read the full record, every time." Simone Waters, who was in her final year at Eastwood Elementary and who would be at the crossing for one more spring before middle school, arrived at the crossing on the morning after the school board meeting at her usual time, which was 7:53, 2 minutes before Nadia, and 4 minutes before the bell. She said, "Good morning, Miss Dolores." Dolores said, "Good morning, Simone. How is chorus?" Simone had been in chorus for 3 years. She said, "We learned a new song yesterday." Dolores said, "Is it good?" Simone said, "It is very hard." She said, "But it sounds good when we get it right." Dolores said, "Most things do." Simone said, "I guess that is true." She said, "I heard somebody at the school board meeting said something about you." Dolores looked at her. She said, "Where did you hear that?" Simone said, "My mom told me." She said, "Was it good what they said?" Dolores said, "Yes." Simone said, "Okay." She said, "I knew it would be." She said, "This is a good corner." Dolores looked at the intersection. The cars at the light, the children arriving in ones and twos. The cold November morning, the crosswalk she had crossed several thousand times. She said, "Yes." She said, "It is a good corner." She raised the paddle. Simone crossed. 16 years at Maple and 7th. Every morning and every afternoon that school was in session, over 3,000 crossings in each direction. No substantive complaint in 16 years. The camera running for 2 of those years and showing on the morning of the most recent complaint what 16 years looked like in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The paddle raised the children crossing in their groups and their singletons and their specific individual paces. The last child on the far side. The nod, the cars moving through. The record was the documentation of what had always been there. The footage was its confirmation. The children who had crossed at Maple and 7th for 5 years and left for middle school carrying with them the particular small certainty of children who have been seen by someone who was entirely paying attention. They carried it the way children carry things that are given to them before they know what to do with it, and they would understand what it was later. That was also part of the record. The part that did not appear in any file. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who have been watching children carefully enough for 16 years to know what they need. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.